There's something strange that happens when you've been in enough relationships. You start to notice things you couldn't see before. Not because you're smarter, but because the pattern has repeated itself enough times that eventually even the quietest signals become audible. I didn't arrive at any of this cleanly. I arrived the way most men do. Confused, then hurt, then slowly, painfully, curious. This isn't a lecture. I'm not standing here with answers I've always had. What I have is a particular kind of education that only comes from paying attention, sometimes too late, and sitting with what you observed afterward. The emotional cost of not understanding these things isn't dramatic. It doesn't usually arrive all at once. It arrives in the quiet, in a Tuesday evening where something feels slightly off, but you can't name it. That's what I want to talk about. Signal 1. The quality of her attention changes before anything else. Because I've noticed over time that the first thing to shift, before words, before behavior, before anything you could point to in an argument, is attention. Not the quantity of it, the quality. There's a kind of attention that a woman gives when she's genuinely interested. It's not always loud, sometimes it's very still. It's the way she listens when you talk about something that happened at work. Not because she cares about the specific story, but because she cares about you inside the story. That kind of attention has a texture to it. It lands differently. When that begins to change, it doesn't announce itself. It's subtle. She's still present. She's still asking questions sometimes, but there's a quality missing. The attention starts to feel a little more administrative, like she's managing the interaction rather than participating in it. What I didn't understand back then is that this isn't necessarily evidence of anything permanent. Attention shifts for 100 reasons. Stress, exhaustion, internal processing that has nothing to do with you. But when it becomes consistent, when the quality stays flat across days, across weeks, that's worth noticing. Psychology has a concept called attunement. It refers to the emotional mirroring that happens between two people when they're genuinely connected. When attunement decreases, you feel it before you understand it. It registers as a vague unease. Men often interpret this unease as their own anxiety, and sometimes it is. But sometimes it's actually accurate perception. The mistake I made, and I've seen this pattern repeat in men around me, is trying to recover the attention by escalating, doing more, being more interesting, essentially performing. What that does is widen the gap, because performance is felt as need, and need, when she's already beginning to pull back, tends to accelerate the distance rather than close it. What serves you better in that moment is stillness. Not silence as a punishment, but stillness as a kind of self-respect. You notice the shift. You don't chase it. You hold your ground and pay attention to what emerges. Signal 2. Laughter becomes selective. This one took me a long time to see clearly, because it sounds almost too small to matter. But I've seen it be one of the earliest indicators of an internal shift, and I think it's underestimated. When a woman is genuinely drawn to someone, her laughter is somewhat unreasonable. She laughs at things that aren't quite funny enough to deserve it. Not fake laughter. Something more honest than that. It's the kind of laugh that has warmth underneath it, that has affection underneath it. The thing you said was fine, but she laughed because she likes you, and she's experiencing you through that filter. When that filter starts to change, laughter becomes more proportional, more accurate in a strange way. The same level of humor now receives the correct amount of reaction, which is sometimes none or very little, and the absence registers. Not loudly, but it registers. I've noticed this pattern most clearly in situations where everything else looked relatively normal. Conversations were happening, logistics were being handled, but the laughter had become precise, measured, appropriate. And that appropriateness felt cold. The psychological explanation for this lives in the concept of positive sentiment override, a term that comes from relationship research. When we feel positively towards someone, we tend to interpret their behavior through a forgiving, even generous lens. Their mediocre joke becomes charming. Their awkward pause becomes endearing. When that override begins to weaken, the same behavior reads differently, more neutrally, sometimes more critically. What men sometimes do when they notice this shift is become funnier, or try to. They lean into humor more deliberately, almost as if they're trying to earn the response back. I've done this. It doesn't work, not because humor is the wrong tool, but because forced humor has a specific signature that women read clearly. It reads as effort. And effort, in this context, reads as awareness that something has changed. The better response, and this is something I had to learn slowly, is to simply be present without auditing her reactions. You don't need her laughter to validate you. That's the internal work. Not needing the warmth to confirm your worth. Signal. 3. Physical proximity shifts in small, specific ways. I want to be careful with this one because it's the most easily misread, and misreading it is where men tend to cause real damage. Physical distance, the subtle, almost imperceptible kind, is one of the most instinctive signals the human nervous system sends out. We don't usually decide to create it. It happens. A few inches of additional space when sitting, a slightly shorter hug. The way she positions her body in a room, not toward you, not away from you, but slightly sideways. I've noticed this doesn't always mean what men fear it means. Nervous systems create distance for a wide range of reasons. Overwhelm, stress, internal preoccupation. Sometimes it's hormonal. Sometimes it's about something that happened that week that had nothing to do with you. The human body is not a perfect communication device. But I've also noticed that when this physical distancing is paired with the other shifts, the attention, the laughter, it starts to form a kind of pattern, a constellation. And constellations are worth paying attention to, even when you're not certain what they mean. What psychology tells us about physical closeness is that it's regulated by the nervous system below the level of conscious decision-making. The technical term is neuroception, the way our nervous systems are constantly scanning for safety or threat in the environment, including in other people. When a woman's nervous system begins to register something as unsafe, whether that's emotional conflict, unresolved tension, or a shift in her own internal experience, proximity decreases instinctively. Without intention. The misinterpretation here is treating this as intentional withdrawal, as something being done to you. When men feel physical distance, the fear response can be strong, and fear often presents as accusation. You've been distant, said with an edge, said in a way that turns a signal into a confrontation. What that does is confirm to a nervous system that the distance was appropriate, because now there's tension, now there's an edge. And nervous systems that are already slightly withdrawn tend to withdraw further when they encounter that energy. The more grounded response is to let the physical space exist without making it mean something catastrophic. You notice it, you stay warm. You don't crowd it, and you don't punish it. You hold a steady, available energy without collapsing into anxiety. Signal 4. She stops mentioning the future. This one arrived in my life so quietly, I almost missed it entirely. It's not something most men are taught to look for, and yet I think it's one of the clearest signals of an internal shift. When a woman is genuinely invested in a connection, she tends to include you in her mental future. This doesn't have to be dramatic. She's not necessarily talking about marriage or children. It's smaller than that. She mentions a restaurant she wants to try sometime implicitly with you. She references something happening next month and includes you in the imagining of it. She speaks about her plans in a way that creates space for your presence. I've noticed that when something begins to shift internally for her, these future-oriented references quietly disappear. The future starts to get referenced in the singular. Her plans become her plans, not secretively, not with announcement. Just naturally, the way things do when the future is being privately reconfigured. It's one of those things you don't notice until you look back and realize how long it's been since she mentioned anything ahead of the present week. And by the time you notice the absence, it's usually been absent for a while. The psychological underpinning of this is connected to emotional investment, specifically to what researchers describe as relationship cognition. When we are emotionally invested in a relationship, we spontaneously include that relationship in our mental models of the future. It's not a deliberate act, it's just where the mind goes. When investment begins to shift, future thinking reorganizes around the individual rather than the pair. Men often misread this as busyness, as distraction, as the kind of temporary preoccupation that comes with stress. and sometimes that's accurate. But there's a qualitative difference between someone who is temporarily preoccupied and someone whose internal relationship with the future has quietly reorganized. The first is about capacity. The second is about orientation. What I've come to understand is that when someone stops including you in their imagined future, the most important thing you can do is ask yourself an honest question: am I doing the same? Because sometimes that mutual disappearance from each other's future is the truest signal in the room, and it points not to betrayal or deception, but to a drift that both people have contributed to, and both people could potentially address if they had the honesty and the timing to try. Signal 5. Her emotional sharing narrows. There's a particular intimacy that develops when someone brings you their interior life, not just their events, not just this happened today, but the actual emotional texture underneath the events, the vulnerability of it, the things they're not sure about, the fears that don't have logical justification. I've noticed that this kind of sharing is both the deepest form of closeness and one of the first things to quietly disappear when something is shifting. It doesn't happen loudly. She doesn't stop talking. The conversations continue, but they migrate slowly and then more noticeably toward the surface, toward logistics, toward observations about the world rather than reflections on her interior. The texture changes. What was once depth becomes competent pleasantness. I felt this transition before I could name it. It presents as a sense that conversations are happening but not quite connecting, like two signals that are close in frequency but slightly off. There's the appearance of communication, but the resonance is missing. What I didn't understand in earlier relationships is that emotional narrowing is often a protective response. When something feels uncertain, when a woman is processing doubt about a connection or managing feelings she hasn't decided how to approach, one of the most natural responses is to reduce emotional exposure, not to deceive, to protect. The irony is that this protective narrowing often produces the very dynamic it's trying to avoid. She shares less, he feels the distance and either pushes harder or withdraws. The gap widens, and the interior experience on both sides becomes increasingly private, increasingly separate. Psychology frames this through the lens of attachment theory. When attachment security begins to feel uncertain, people regulate their emotional exposure instinctively. Those with anxious attachment tend to share more, seeking reassurance through disclosure. Those with more avoidant tendencies share less, seeking safety through self-containment. Most people have elements of both depending on the situation. What I've learned, and this came with real difficulty, is that the response to emotional narrowing is not to demand more openness. Not to say, with frustration, you never tell me anything anymore. That closes the door further. The response, if there is one, is to model openness yourself without requiring reciprocity. To share something real, something honest, and then let it sit without expectation. Sometimes the door reopens, sometimes it doesn't, but at least you offered something genuine rather than a demand. Signal 6. Irritability appears, without an obvious cause. This is the signal that causes the most immediate damage when men respond to it poorly, because irritability feels like an attack. And it's very hard, when something feels like an attack, to not become defensive. I've noticed that when a woman is experiencing internal conflict about a relationship, about her own feelings, about something she hasn't yet put into words, it can surface as an irritability that seems disproportionate or disconnected from the specific moment. Something small triggers something large. The reaction doesn't match the event. And men, reasonably, focus on the event. They try to address the specific thing, the thing that was said or not said, the plan that changed, the comment that landed wrong. They defend themselves against the surface complaint, not understanding that the surface complaint is not the actual content. What I've come to understand is that this kind of mismatched irritability is often what happens when emotion is looking for a container and can't find the right one. The internal experience, the doubt, the conflict, the unresolved feeling has weight. It needs somewhere to go. And in the absence of a clear and safe place to go, it sometimes surfaces as friction, as sharpness, as a kind of irritability that neither person fully understands. The psychological framing for this involves what's sometimes called emotional displacement, the phenomenon where feeling directed at one thing finds expression in relation to another. It's not malicious. It's not even always conscious. It's the nervous system under pressure, looking for release. The mistake, and I've made this mistake with force, is treating the irritability as the truth, matching it, escalating into it, turning a moment of displaced emotional pressure into a full argument that leaves both people feeling worse and no clearer. What de-escalation actually looks like in practice is quieter than it sounds in theory. It means not taking the bait of the surface complaint. It means staying regulated when the emotional temperature rises, not silence as stonewalling, but stillness as refusal to escalate. It means saying calmly, "Something feels heavy today. Do you want to talk about it?" And then accepting whatever answer comes without pressure. That kind of steadiness is not passivity. It is, I've come to believe, one of the most difficult and most meaningful things a man can offer in a moment of emotional turbulence. Signal 7. You start to feel like a conclusion she's already reached. This last one is the most difficult to describe because it's not a behavior, it's a feeling. And we are often taught to distrust feelings, especially when we can't substantiate them with events. But I've noticed, over time, across different relationships, in conversations with men who have lived longer than me and paid attention, that there's a particular quality of distance that feels like a decision already made. Not announced, not explained, but felt. It's in the way she looks at you sometimes, not with contempt, not with coldness, but with something that resembles a kind of resignation. Like she already knows something and is simply waiting for the moment to be appropriate to say it. I want to be very careful here, because this feeling, more than any of the others, is the one most likely to be a projection, most likely to be your own anxiety wearing the costume of perception. Men who are anxiously attached, men who have experienced abandonment, men who carry old wounds from past relationships. They sometimes feel this quality of conclusion in situations where it doesn't actually exist. They read finality into normal quiet. They interpret ordinary distance as farewell. So I hold this signal more loosely than the others. I think it's worth noting, worth paying attention to, but not worth acting on in isolation. It needs to be part of a larger pattern before it becomes meaningful information rather than anxious noise. What psychology says about this is interesting. There's research suggesting that we are capable of picking up extraordinarily subtle cues from other people, micro-expressions, shifts in vocal tone, changes in the timing and texture of responses that register in our nervous system before they become conscious thoughts. This is sometimes described as implicit relational knowing. We sense things we can't yet articulate. The question is whether what we're sensing is real perception or old pattern. And that distinction is one of the hardest things to make clearly, especially when you're inside the emotional weather of a relationship you care about. What I've found useful, not always, not perfectly, but often enough, is to let some time pass before I decide what I'm perceiving. To give the feeling a few days to either deepen or dissolve. If it deepens, it's probably pointing at something real. If it dissolves with a change in context, it was more likely my own interior noise than an accurate reading of her state. And if it deepens, the response is not confrontation. It is a quiet, honest conversation. Not an interrogation, not an accusation, where you name what you've been feeling without requiring her to validate it. I felt some distance lately. I don't know exactly what it is, I just wanted to say it out loud. And then you wait, and you listen, and you try to hear what comes back without filtering it through what you fear. I've spent time sitting with all of this, not to become better at detecting deception, not to build some kind of defensive system against being hurt. That's not why I pay attention to these things anymore. I pay attention because I've learned, slowly and with real cost, that the alternative to awareness is a kind of blundering through relationships that is painful for everyone involved. When you don't understand what you're seeing, you react to it. When you react to it, you often make it worse. And when you make it worse, you look back later and realize that the damage was done not by the original problem, but by the response to it. None of these signals are proof of anything. They are signals, information. And information, when received without panic, is actually a gift. even when what it's pointing toward is painful. What I've come to believe is that emotional awareness isn't about gaining certainty. It's about staying in contact with reality while you're inside it, rather than constructing a story about it that your fear writes. Fear writes the worst story. Awareness writes a more accurate one. The men I'd watched navigate these moments best, the ones who came out the other side with their dignity intact, regardless of what happened with the relationship, were not the ones who fought hardest, or accused most clearly, or demanded the most certainty. They were the ones who could sit with ambiguity, who could say, I notice this. I don't know what it means yet. I'm going to stay present, stay grounded, and see what becomes clear. That's a hard thing to embody. I won't pretend otherwise. When you care about someone and you sense that something is shifting, the instinct is not stillness. The instinct is action, to do something, to fix something, to demand something that will make the uncertainty stop. But certainty is not always available, and the attempt to force it, through accusation, through ultimatum, through emotional pressure, tends to destroy the very thing you're trying to preserve. What's left, then, is something simpler and more difficult than strategy. It's self-respect, not as armor, not as distance, but as the baseline condition from which you interact with another person, the understanding that you are not defined by whether she chooses you, that your value is not located in her attention or her laughter or her proximity or the future she does or doesn't include you in. That sounds like something you'd read on a card. It sounds like it should be easier to practice than it is. Because the truth is that when you're in the middle of caring about someone, your self-respect is genuinely tested. It's tested by the instinct to make yourself smaller in hope that she'll stay. It's tested by the fear that if you hold your ground, she'll leave. It's tested by the question every man asks himself in these quiet, heavy moments. Is this me? Is this something I did? Is there something I'm not seeing about myself that keeps producing this outcome? Dashta, those are good questions. Those are the right questions. Not asked as punishment, but as honest inquiry. Because sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes there's a pattern in your own behavior that's worth examining, that's worth changing. And sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes two people simply drift or want different things, or arrive at different places at different times, and it has nothing to do with fault. The wisdom, as far as I've found it, is in learning to ask the question without already knowing the answer you want to hear. I don't know that I've arrived anywhere permanent. I'm still inside this learning. I still notice these signals and feel the pull of old reactions. I still catch myself sometimes about to chase something. It would be better to let move at its own pace. But I notice it earlier now. I let it sit without immediately acting. I try to ask the honest question before I write the fearful story. That's not resolution. It's not the end of confusion. It's just a slightly more conscious way of moving through something that, for most of us, never becomes fully simple. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the most honest place to leave this. Not with answers, but with a slightly better set of questions, with a little more patience for ambiguity, with a little more respect for your own perception without letting your fear distort it. The game, as some people like to call it, doesn't flip because you found the right tactic. It changes, slowly, internally, when you stop needing it to go a particular way. That's where I keep arriving. And then, sometimes, I have to find my way back to it again,